The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len Beyea, and with me this evening are three local citizens who are active on housing issues, and we are going to be talking about something about housing affordability, housing security, and also about rent control and the Citizens Initiative, which will be on the ballot in November, which repeals the Costa Hawkins Act and enables cities and counties to implement rent control if they see fit. So first, I want to welcome our guests, Lee Brokaw, Lira Filipini, and Rick Longinotti. And I'm going to ask you each to go ahead and introduce yourselves. Lee, why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners who you are?
Thank you. I'm a general contractor. I've been in town for about 24 years, so I'm kind of new to town. And I've been watching construction around town, the large developments, and have been doing my own visual QC from afar, and have some pretty strong opinions about how buildings are being built. And I'll just let it go at that.
All right. Thank you. And Lira?
Hi. Well, I moved to UC Santa Cruz in 2002 as a sociology student at UCSC. Fell in love with it and ended up back here again recently. So all total, probably about 11 years now. But my main background is as an artist as well as in the nonprofit sector. So I work for a lot of nonprofit organizations and grant writing and stuff like that, but got very engaged in housing legislation and watching what it's doing to our current community here in Santa Cruz and beyond throughout the state.
Great, thank you. And Rick Longinotti, you're coming to us remotely. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi Len, and can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, well, I got started working on rent control actually in 1978 in the aftermath of Prop 13 passing, when landlords got windfall refunds on their taxes. And we asked, we had in San Francisco, we had a ballot measure to pass that, some of that savings on to tenants, and it failed. And so the following year, we put another initiative on the ballot to enact rent control, and that prompted the Board of Supervisors to actually pass rent control, which still exists in San Francisco. So ever since then, I've on and off get involved with housing issues because it doesn't get any better, does it?
No, I think we can all attest that it hasn't gotten better unless your only measure is what is property worth. But what's the monetary value if it doesn't have other values built in? That's always going to be an issue. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about Proposition 33, which is a November ballot measure that ends statewide rent control restrictions in California. And people may not be aware of this because there is, of course, rent control in a number of cities and counties in the state. But what you might not know is that rent control does not apply if there's a change of ownership. It does not apply if there's a change of tenancy. And it does not apply to anything built since 1993. And that's from legislation passed in 1994 called the Costa Hawkins Act, or generally known as that. And it placed all these restrictions on rent control. So you can imagine, and perhaps you are even familiar with a situation that you or someone you know went through where property sold and the rent jumped up 40%, with a new owner, or somebody moved out of a rent-controlled apartment, and when the next person moved in, it cost twice as much. So these kinds of things happen a lot, and they do get manipulated, which is kind of crazy, but it's one reason that eviction rates are so high in California, is because it's in the financial interest often of landlords to evict someone rather than negotiate over, rent being paid 2 or 3 days late. Because then they can, if they're in a rent-controlled community, they can immediately raise the rent as much as they want. So it's one of those kind of double-edged swords here, that there are some cities and counties with rent control, but they are so restricted in how it works that it generally doesn't work very well. Anyway, this proposition that's on the ballot, it reads here. Here's the proposition. It's one sentence. How often do we get that on an initiative on the ballot? The state may not limit the right of any city, county, or city and county, San Francisco is both at the same time, to maintain, enact, or expand residential rent control. That's it. That's all it says. And in effect, by passing this initiative, this would repeal the restrictions that are in Costa Hawkins. Now, what it doesn't do is it doesn't create statewide rent control. Every city and county would each have to implement it on their own. If they already have it, they could make changes to it on their own, but it does not create rent control. All it does is allow cities and counties to create rent control to suit their particular circumstances, if they saw fit. So that's what it does. It's been endorsed by the California Democratic Party. It's been endorsed by about a dozen unions. It's been endorsed by a lot of housing advocacy groups, veterans advocacy groups. The counties of San Francisco and LA, both boards of supervisors, have endorsed it. A whole bunch of chapters of Indivisible, for those of you familiar with the organization that started up after the first election of Donald Trump. And also by the Dolores Huerta Foundation, among other organizations. They've all endorsed it. And as of 2 weeks ago, corporate landlords had already shelled out over $90 million so far, to kill Proposition 33. And at this rate, if they keep it up in terms of their spending on this campaign, they will shell out more than $100 million to try to stop the expansion of rent control in California, and also to pass Proposition 34, which is a ballot measure that the Bay Area News Group editorial board describes as a revenge of the landlords initiative. Proposition 34 essentially says nonprofit healthcare organizations, they don't mention AIDS Healthcare Foundation specifically, but nonprofit healthcare organizations cannot put money into citizens' initiatives. And of course, they were behind getting Proposition 33 on the ballot. They helped that petition drive. So that's what Prop 34 would do, is say, oh boy, not only do we want to beat Prop 33 this time, but we want to make sure that this organization can never back a citizens' initiative again, or any organization like it. So that's what Prop 34 is. And, a lot of these landlords, we're not talking, mom and pop landlords. We're talking about corporate landlords, Essex Property Trust, Equity Residential, Avalon Bay Communities, Gray Star, and a number of others. The California Apartment Association, they're funding both the No on Prop 33 and Yes on Prop 34 campaigns, and they use, as hopefully everyone is aware, that now you can use different committees to sort of shelter money coming from one entity or another. So they use the California Apartment Association Issues Committee as the source of collecting the money from these different corporations who then put the money into the campaign. Let me see. I just want to grab a couple quick figures here. The California Apartment Association Issues Committee, for one, as of early September, had raised $58.7 million to fund the No on Proposition 33 and Yes on Prop 34 campaigns. Out of that $58.7 million, $48.3 million, or 82%, came from just 21 corporate landlords. All right?
Wow.
And those 21 corporate landlords, 11 are the largest corporate landlords in the United States, according to the National Multifamily Housing Council's top 50 apartment owners lists. So they're definitely aiming to kill Prop 33 and silence the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. The Association of Realtors, another powerful lobbying group for the real estate industry, has raised $27 million to stop Prop 33. And they have a political action committee called Home Ownership for Families, No on 33. I love the names they give these organizations. It's really like, woohoo, let's call it apple pie with cheddar cheese. Anyway, so in any case, it's if the trend continues, they will certainly have spent more than $100 million to sway voters' opinions by the election day. There was a similar, more complicated, but somewhat similar measure on the ballot 2 years ago that would have not repealed Costa Hawkins, but replaced it with a sort of modernized version. And again, these same interests, large corporate landlords, Association of Realtors, California Apartment Association, these groups outspent the Yes campaign by 5.5 to 1 in 2022. So here we are, once again. So that's kind of where things stand. You know, whether you're for it or against it, I think it's important to understand that the amount of money going into this is not designed necessarily to inform. It's designed to essentially just sway people's opinions of things. And, you know, this is such a simple measure. Well, we'll get into it. So, so you all, I'm going to say all three of you have been involved in, you know, looking closely at housing issues from many angles, you know, from the land use point of view, from the affordability point of view, from how planning and building inspection operate. And clearly there are other issues that affect the affordability of housing, that affect the availability of housing. Rent control is just a piece of that. Or, you know, the high rents are just a piece of that. So I want to just open it up to you, and I want to start with you, Rick, if you would. Where do you see this as an issue sort of within the spectrum of things that affect housing affordability?
Well, I think that this issue really brings up whether or not we think of our fellow residents of the state with any kind of bond of connection. I mean, do we care that people get priced out? I mean, I'm a homeowner. I'm not going to get priced out. But do I care? Do other homeowners care? You know, if neighbors are leaving our communities in droves, or the ones that stay have intense pressure to, you know, get a second job or, you know, cut back on expenses that, you know, that we all sort of expect to meet needs. I mean, it's really a question of whether or not we're a community, because what's happening to people right here in our own community is suffering. And, you know, you hear a lot of arguments against rent control, and, you know, same old ones that I heard in 1979, that it doesn't, you know, it's the housing stock's going to decline and so on and so forth. And, you know, there are grains of truth in that, but it doesn't mean that we stop protecting the most vulnerable people in our community. We need to address the fact that if the rental housing stock declines, well, we can address that. But to not do rent control, it's an absurdity, and the only way to advocate for that position is to shut yourself down to what is going on right in our own community.
Lira, what's your initial take on all of this?
My initial take is that I love how simple this proposition is, and I think that in discussing it, we should look at that simplicity as much as possible, because there's going to be a lot of conversation about rent control as like a value, and do we need it, do we not? And what this proposition does is it decentralizes the power around it. It's saying this is not up to the state to regulate, and it's not up to the state to create barriers. It is up to local jurisdictions, to cities and counties, to understand their own populations and their own populations' needs the best, and put that power into those local communities to come up with their own ideas about and discussions around rent control and what that would look like for the needs of that particular community, and then put together their own propositions locally. And that, I think, is incredibly powerful. And I don't know if we're going to get to it today, but it's the opposite of what the state legislation is doing right now when it comes to land use and housing, where they have taken local control away from communities, away from cities and counties, and taken it on the state level, actually going against our California Constitution. So I think that in a way this is, in a kind of adjacent topic, still around housing, but rent control instead of producing housing, putting it into the power of local communities, and I think that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've been talking about community, and I feel totally unqualified to talk about community, except that I'm part of it. I think that the housing laws that have come down from the state, dictatorially, authoritarianly, if that's a word, have destroyed community. Because what is community? It's a group of people who live in the same place saying, we want our surroundings to look this way. Now, there are some aspects of that, like redlining and keeping certain kinds of people from living in your neighborhood, which I'm totally against. But from the standpoint of setbacks and density and building height and no parking in high rises because you're on a bus line, like everybody's going to take a bus to work, that kind of stuff, I think, is just, it destroys the community. We had a measure that said we wanted to vote on building heights. And if you drive towards New Leaf, you'll see, I think must be the elevator shaft for that new building that's going up. And that sucker is way up in the air. I don't know what the number of floors that building's going to be, but it's going to be higher than anything else in town. And then you look at the proposal for the clock tower of 18 stories. That's not what the community wants, but our hands are tied. And I find that to be very frustrating. And if there's a unconstitutional aspect to that, which I totally agree, I just can't put my verbs on it.
It's called home rule. It's actually in our California Constitution.
Cool. Yeah. See, that's why I wanted you here. The walking encyclopedia.
So we need to get there. We need to get there. But I do want to say, I mean, people, even people on our city council say our hands are tied. But in fact, the city had the opportunity when they created something, again, mandated by the state. They're called objective design standards. Now, objective design standards can't say things like you can only build this type of use, like you can only build an apartment building, or you can only build single family, you can only build a duplex or whatever. What they do is they say, whatever you build has to meet these design standards. Well, if you put in a design standard that says you can't shade the adjacent property for more than 3 hours a day, for example, I'm just pulling something out of the air here, that's an objective design standard. And if you say that, you can't build too tall. You can't do it.
You can't
right?
block. You can't
Now,
block other people's solar.
If the other building is, equal height, then obviously it's not much of an issue. But if the other building is, 12 stories shorter than yours, it's an issue. So those are things that the city could have adopted, which would fit within the purview of the state, that would have restricted, not altogether to a particular height, but would have restricted things within some, level of compatibility to adjacent properties. So, these are things that the city had a choice on, but they didn't take those particular kinds of choices. They made sure that the design standards they adopted did not restrict development in any significant way.
Well, you hit it right there at the end. They actually, one of the things that they were told definitively by the state was that they could not adopt objective design standards that would inhibit residential capacity beyond what is already in the code. And so with this new legislation, it's the general plan, not the zoning ordinance. General plan supersedes the zoning ordinance. And so whatever height limits that are in the general plan, they could not adopt any objective design standards that would limit beyond that.
Right.
And even with all of that, there was a lot of stuff that went down during this setting of objective design standards that was a little bit shady, I would say, to that bad pun. I don't know if anyone caught that. But they actually did this one particular thing where they codified something that did not need to be codified. And it was like something that was implied in the general plan, but not actually set in stone in any way. And the city staff just were implementing it the way that they wanted it to be. And then they codified it. And that was that there were no density limits when it's SROs or SOUs, which they got rid of. Those were small ownership units, or small studios. So before it was up to 40 units per acre for a certain density and in certain zoning within the general plan. But there's this one land use policy that said you could make an exception for these bullet pointed types of units. And what the city staff did during the setting of the objective design standards was like, we actually want to codify this and make it very explicit that there's literally zero limit to these types of units. And they created another unit type during that period. They got rid of SOUs, the small ownership units, and replaced it with flexible density units, FDUs. And
Which
those
is very flexible.
it's very flexible, and it allows developers to kind of just basically say we have no density limits whatsoever, and we see your objective design standards and we raise you our waivers and our concessions because we have a density bonus.
Yeah, and these details count. They really have an effect on what can go forward. I did want to come back to something that you said, Rick. You mentioned about, there's been statements that having rent control will cause a decline in rental housing stock. And was one study done back in, I believe it was the late 70s or early 80s, that came up with that conclusion. But in fact, it's been refuted by a lot of research since then. And it's been found that it did not have a significant effect at all, or a measurable, it was lost in the noise, essentially, of how much effect rent control had on rental housing stock. And there's even situations in some cities and counties where with rent control, that amount of rental stock actually increased, not because of it, but it increased anyway, right? And there was a group of 32 top economists wrote a letter to the Biden administration late last year supporting rent control and asking the federal government, the Biden administration specifically, to implement rent control on all Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac financed mortgaged rental property. They wrote that rent control will, quote, protect tenants, stabilize neighborhoods, promote income diversity in regional economies, and improve the long-term outlook for housing affordability. And then they added, we have seen the devastating impact of a poorly regulated housing market on people's livelihoods as already unaffordable rental prices outpace wage growth. And, you know, they made a comparison between the research on rent control and the research on minimum wages, where, you know, there's been an argument that if you raise the minimum wage, it's going to cause all kinds of unemployment. Well, empirical data does not support that, and economists have pretty generally finally come to consensus on this, that raising the minimum wage does not increase unemployment. Well, they make the comparison, and they said that same sort of model that predicted that rent regulations would have a negative effect on the housing sector is, quote, being proven wrong by empirical studies that better analyze real-world dynamics. For example, empirical research on local rent control policies in San Francisco, California, and New York, found that rent regulations lower housing costs for households living in regulated units. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, empirical research showed that the repeal of rent stabilization laws resulted in an average rent increase of $131 for tenants, and that rent control helps stem tenant displacement in a high-cost market, even when the rent control is limited, in this case by Costa Hawkins, in the case of San Francisco. So anyway.
Well, Len, I'm glad you brought that research out that refutes that argument. I mean, we always knew that argument wasn't the real reason that there's all this money behind ending rent control. It wasn't to increase the housing stock, right?
Right.
It was, just pure economic self-interest. I just want to mention a story, just to kind of give a real life example here. There's a family member of mine who lives in San Francisco in a rent-controlled apartment. She got COVID. She got long COVID. She worked as a bartender, had to quit her job. So she could not afford to live anywhere, if it weren't a rent-controlled apartment. She's been in there for, more than 20 years. So it's, she talks to my wife every day. This is somebody, who's profoundly affected by the fact that there's a protection. And sometimes when we're in our community, the Santa Cruz County, where we don't experience rent control, it's sort of imaginary for us, but there are people that are every bit as in need of that kind of protection here. And if they don't get it, then, we know what the consequences are. They're to the point that people end up homeless. So it's a real deal, of the measures that are on the ballot, in California ballot. This is a profound one with, big impacts.
Yeah, and I think everyone is at least subliminally aware that income hasn't kept pace with housing costs. And if you look at the ratio of the average cost of a home from, I don't remember the exact year, I think it was 1972, and to the average cost of home to average income, compared to average cost of home to average income ratio in 2016, it had doubled. In other words, you had half as much buying power for buying a home, over a course of basically some 30 years. That's a huge change in the affordability of housing. And Lee, you've referred to this before. I mean, maybe it isn't rent control we need. Maybe it's income control. In the upper direction, right?
I entered the workforce in 1970 after 2 years in the military in Germany. And I keep hearing economists say that adjusted for inflation, wages have remained constant since 1970. And fortunately, I chose a profession where I was in charge of the amount of money I made or the amount of money I chose not to make, in my case. I chose not to file change orders. I chose not to charge profit for the first 10 years I was in business. And even at that, I was way under what my competitors were doing. I started renting in Palo Alto at $185 a month from Ruth Levette, who owned 13 houses next to Stanford that her mother and father had built. And I realized as I was aging that I didn't want to be stuck there. And actually, I could have bought the house across the street in 1970 for $40,000 in Palo Alto. And the money in the family was with my grandmother. I'm not going to go into that story, but I didn't get the down payment I was hoping for. So I remained a renter for 40 years. And as I had bought my house in Santa Cruz, because I couldn't afford anything in Palo Alto, the property manager changed to a real estate attorney, big bucks guy, and I was paying $2,000 a month now, 30 some odd years later. And I said, hey, I've been here so long, let me walk you through. I'll tell you where I changed the water heater and what happened during the '89 earthquake and all that sort of stuff. And he just grinned and he says, well, you're going to pay $4,000 a month in the next couple of years. And since he was an attorney, I did not hit him. And I decided then and there, I started moving my organic garden, 5-gallon buckets in the back of my truck, to the house that I'd bought in Santa Cruz. And I'm fortunate, but I bought my house when I was 55. And I see the YIMBY group, which all appear to be young, advocating that they should be able to buy a house now. And, well, if you happen to be in that group that's working for Google and making $200,000 a year, yeah, you should be able to buy a house, even at today's expense. But most of my generation had to work hard to get to a point where we could buy a house. And the income disparity, income inequality is huge. I think in Santa Cruz, the work from home, COVID policy is why our average mean income is skyrocketed. And I have the son of a very, very good friend who works for tech, and he's making $250,000 a year, and he came over and bought a house. And it's like, hey, I mean, more power to him, but enough of those people coming over here totally skews our purchasing power. And when they talk about one more point, when we talk about affordable housing, we're focusing on the housing part. We're making money for the developers and the investors, and we're not doing anything to make things affordable. If you have to make $79 an hour to afford an affordable apartment, or at today's prevailing wage, you have to work 4.9 40-hour-a-week jobs in order to move into that 600-square-foot bedroom studio apartment, that just doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Yeah, and it's underscored by the fact that when they've done surveys of the homeless people in our community, the majority of them used to have houses here. They used to have a home, an address, a kitchen, a bathroom, here in town. And they got to a point where they couldn't pay, and now they're on the street.
I, in the last week, have seen 2 ladies pushing shopping carts, and they hadn't been on the street very long. I mean, I looked at them and I went, wow, I bet you were at a PTA meeting a month ago. They were clean, and they had their possessions in a shopping cart. They obviously had recently lost their housing. And the homeless haters have really poisoned the water about taking care of our homeless people. By the way, the veterans will be feeding the homeless Thanksgiving dinner this year, as we have for the past 35 years. Get a plug in there.
Yay, good plug. And while we're plugging, if you've just tuned in recently to Talk of the Bay here at KSQD, we are talking about housing affordability in general. We are talking about Citizens Initiative Proposition 33, which is on the ballot in November, which reads that the state may not limit the right of any city, county, or city and county to maintain, enact, or expand residential rent control. which essentially that's it. It's one sentence, that initiative, but it removes the current statewide restrictions on local rent control. Doesn't create rent control, but removes those restrictions. And my guests are Lee Brokaw, Lira Filipini, and Rick Longinotti, all local citizens who have been active on housing issues. We've talked a lot about, what makes sense in terms of local control versus state control. We've talked a little bit about, the amount of money that goes into these initiative campaigns. And we haven't talked about the other things that affect housing affordability, things that might work, things that pretty much have proven not to work. And I want to just open this up. You've all made reference to sort of broader issues that are affected by the situation of housing and rents. That was not an explosion. You can relax. It's a very small item falling on the floor. Yes, I know. Even though we say here at KSQD we are on the air, we actually do have a floor and we're on the ground. So, so when things fall here in the studio, you hear it hit the floor. And sorry about that. But moving on, we've all seen things going on that you could probably tell are not helping. And maybe you happen to be one of those lucky people who's seen the things going on that are helping. And I just want to kind of talk about, what's next. And if this proposition passes in November, it may be, I'd say it's certain that cities that already have control will probably amend their current rent control ordinances. I have no idea if other cities will adopt rent control, but at least it opens the door. But meantime, we still face housing affordability issues today. And there has been a movement, what's generally referred to as the YIMBY movement, that says, well, if you build more, it'll become cheaper, which is patently proven false by many circumstances. There's been studies done in LA. There's been studies done even here in Santa Cruz where, if the housing you're building is at the top of the rental market, it's not going to do anything for the people who have been displaced or who are in need of housing. And I used to be comfortably a step away from all of this, but I just learned 2 weeks ago that the home I'm renting, which I've been in for over 10 years, is going to be sold at the first of the year, put on the market at the first of the year. And, I have been a homeowner, but for circumstances I won't go into, I am no longer a homeowner. And, I'm looking at a situation where to move into a similar dwelling to what I'm in now, I will be seeing at least 50% increase in rent. And I just retired last year, and I'm not in a position to do that. So I may have to leave Santa Cruz after 54 years here, but that's the nature of the beast that we're looking at. And it isn't because there aren't vacant rental units available. It's because the price of those vacant rental units is not attainable by most of the people who are looking. And there's lots of data to back that up. So just getting more housing, obviously we need more, but just getting more without any criteria to guide that is not a solution. And so I wanted to just open it up to you all and see what
more new housing is more expensive than older housing that's already in existence. I'm living in a 1919 Craftsman. On an editorial I wrote, I calculated it's something like 38,000 nights. That house has housed people without a new tree being cut. But today, as a builder, we're bringing lumber from out of the country. We're mining copper for wire and plumbing. And the diesel trucks that transport all of that around the state have been mandated by the state to have newer diesels, and so the transportation costs have skyrocketed, and the cost of new housing is really expensive. When I got into business, I felt embarrassed to charge $200 a square foot. Now cost of housing starts at $1,000 a square foot. So building more $1,000, $1,500 a square foot housing abodes, I hate the word unit, is not going to improve things. Use the automobile industry as an example. They're almost totally automated with robots. They work indoors. We build outdoors in the elements and sometimes can't, and we can't work at night. But are automobiles cheaper because they're mass produced? They're not. So anybody who's singing the song that more housing will make it cheaper is uninformed.
And yet you can see why it's such an attractive idea, right? Because it is a very stressful situation that we're in right now with this cost of housing. It's one of the most basic human needs, and it has skyrocketed. So to try to live in California and not be incredibly rent burdened, you know, we have to find solutions. And it's a very, very easy idea to wrap your head around the like scarcity, the supply and demand, that very basic principle. And so it's understandable why so many people have grabbed onto it. And yet if you really look, you know, you both have already made it really clear that this is not, just building more is not going to reduce the price overall. And in fact, what we see is, especially with some of this new state legislation, for instance, the density bonus law, these developers get a massive density bonus. They get for providing a certain percentage of affordable housing, which here in Santa Cruz, they will automatically be providing because we have an inclusionary ordinance. It makes it so they have to produce a certain percentage. When they do produce that percentage, they are automatically entitled to a density bonus. And depending on what they put that income level at for the percentage they produce, they can get up to a 50%. And actually now there are layers of other state legislation that like you can add up and it can become actually 100%. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but
like
there's
doubling the units. Yeah.
Oh yeah, like quite literally doubling the number of units that you're allowed to produce on a certain piece of property based on the local zoning and code. And so the real big problem with that, though, this is where I'm getting to, is that all of these extra units that they're getting with this density bonus are market rate. So when you look at the overall ratio of what you're building affordable to market rate, you are seeing a huge increase in the percentage being market rate and a huge decrease being affordable. And when you keep those rents, you know, at that rate, you are inviting people in who can afford those rents, and you are increasing what we then call the AMI, or area median income, which is what we then, you know, base what is affordable on. So what's affordable here in Santa Cruz is actually not really affordable at all. And this is just kind of a perpetuating cycle that gets worse and worse. And so what we're looking at right now is just an ongoing battle. And I actually think it's really important that you brought up Prop 34, because I hadn't even heard about that one. And what you're really looking at is, you know, the AIDS Foundation being kind of the driving force behind Prop 33, no longer being able to put stuff like this on the ballot and fund stuff like this if Prop 34 is passed. And the AIDS Foundation also has a side organization called Housing is a Human Right, and they've done a huge amount of research on all of this, a really well-researched expose on YIMBY and trying to understand YIMBY, why it exists, why it's really easy to be captivated by it when your heartstrings are pulled because you see the need for affordable housing, and yet why it is actually part of this perpetuating mechanism, making things much, much worse. And I think that book is called Selling Off California. Rick will actually know. We were in a book club together and read this book together.
Yeah, I think that's the name. I wanted to, you know, just share a little bit about being a landlord. So my parents bought a building in San Francisco in 1956, and when they passed away, it got inherited by my 5 siblings and myself. There are 5 flats in the building. the building's long paid off. It was paid off long before my parents passed away. And so there's no mortgage payments on the building. The only expenses on the building are the kind of maintenance, the kinds of repair, some once in a while capital investments to maintain the building, and taxes. And so the rental income just keeps going up because it as the apartments become available, they become decontrolled, and my family then sets it at pretty close to market rate. The profit margin is much greater than my parents were getting, and I feel conflicted about that. Is housing a human right, or is it a profit opportunity? And I think we have a clash going on here, and it affects a lot of people who are kind of small landlords like myself, who in our own community, we had a rent control ballot measure in 2018, and it lost pretty badly. And not only that, it spawned a landlord lobby group that is very powerful to this day, and is able to kill off measures like the empty homes tax, which was such a very moderate and reasonable measure to just do some taxing on homes that are not occupied for 9 months of the year. So the reason that this group is so powerful is there are a lot of small landlords who are perceiving their own financial interest, in keeping a lid on any kind of movement towards rent control. And just cause eviction, and that's a problem, And I think it's a problem that's broader. It's like, okay, so Social Security, who's going to live on that? Some people do, but it's really a marginal life. So retirees who have a piece of property where they're getting an income, I get it. We don't have a society that with real Social Security for people, so you have to look at ways to make profit. But I think we need to spread the idea that maybe a better way to make profit might be to invest in the stock market or something like that. That investing in housing, when it comes at the expense of tenants who really, are insecure, then that it's not such an ethical way to make your profit.
I just want to throw in a personal experience. My stepfather and I were driving around the country looking at graduate schools in 1968, 65. And we stopped in San Francisco because I wanted to go to UC Berkeley. And we stayed with a friend of his out in the Mission. And I wasn't paying too much attention to what they were talking about because they had an old friend they were talking about who had left San Francisco and gone to Virginia for a new job. And he was so thoroughly discouraged with that job, he wanted to move back. And the man that we were visiting with said, he can't. He left the state. There's no way he can move back into the state. And that was the situation for housing costs in this state in that time compared to coming from out of state. You can't come back and buy your way in. So this is not new. It's been this way for a long time, and I don't hear anybody talking about it. This is just one of those things that you remember and you go, why do I remember that? But I do.
Yeah, and it's been historically true that region to region in the United States, the cost of housing, cost of land has varied quite a bit. It hasn't always been the barrier it is now because, back, I remember getting my first job, my first full-time job in 1970, and I was earning minimum wage. And on minimum wage, I had a full refrigerator, I could pay rent, I could own a car.
Wow.
You can't do that on minimum wage anymore. So, I think part of it is income not keeping up, But to Rick's point about this conflict, I think we've had policies put in place that sort of it's kind of a divide and conquer. If you do own housing, you have a financial interest in it going up in value. You have a financial interest in when the rents in your neighborhood go up, why not raise yours to keep up with the neighbors, right? It creates this conflicting motivation. And I'm in both positions. I own property elsewhere that is rented out. I do own it free and clear, and I only raise the rent when my expenses go up, which is pretty slowly, except for insurance, I have to admit. But, I'm a renter here, even though I've lived here for over 50 years, and I don't have that flexibility. So the thing we've seen is we've set up a whole lot of regulations in the country and in the state that tend to facilitate purchasing property as an investment, but they haven't got balancing regulations to protect housing as shelter, like giving that some weight, some priority to protect people who don't necessarily have the means to buy and sell property.
I have another one of those things of why I remember this. I distinctly remember Ronald Reagan announcing that he was taking the cost of housing and the cost of food out of the consumer price index, which is what they use to create the rate of inflation. And I was young enough then that I wasn't thinking about Social Security raises or any of that sort of stuff. But our economic system is partially skewed by how bad inflation is. Well, imagine what inflation would be if the cost of housing and the cost of food was included, and it's not to this day.
Yeah. So, as they say, figures don't lie, but liars figure.
Reagan's
it's really
revenge.
easy to manipulate. And I mean, he also changed the way that we count unemployment in this country. And when they changed it during the Reagan administration, there was an instantaneous drop in the unemployment rate because they changed the way they calculated it. So it's, I think it dropped like 0.75% just by a change of rule of how you count it. So it's
complex.
It's not that these things are not, real relative measures over time, but they aren't necessarily measuring an absolute reality. You kind of have to keep that in mind when you hear statistics about this stuff. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I'm going to invite each of you to just say what you think you'd like to see in the future in terms of how to address housing affordability, and also I'm taking a poll, and if you're willing, you can pass. But if you're willing, I'm curious if you think you'd support Proposition 33 on the November ballot. So I'm going to start with you, Rick, because you can't see the rest of us. So I want to give you a head start.
I've got a pretty good picture in my head. Okay, well, so the question is about what we foresee.
What would you like to see?
What would I like to see? And I want to just be real practical here. It's something that I think is doable, is that there be a tenant right to counsel, meaning that there would be some publicly funded tenant legal assistance. When I was living in San Francisco, the roof was leaking. We couldn't get the landlords to fix it. Finally, we withheld the rent. The only reason that we were brave enough to withhold the rent was that there was rent control in San Francisco, and there was a rent board. I ended up showing it up before the rent board, and the rent board said, "You guys got to fix the roof." We had little kids crawling on the floor in the house with the carpet, and the carpet was growing mushrooms.
Oh, my.
It wasn't safe. So if we have tenant right to counsel, we can deal with some of those unscrupulous practices of landlords, and that's a doable thing to get our community to fund. The other thing I would like to see is on account of state legislation has drastically reduced the amount of parking that new development has to build, and I would love to see that savings passed on to tenants. So I'd like to see our local community pass an ordinance that says that tenants can opt out of parking. They can buy one less parking place or 0 parking places, and they can save on their rent by separating the cost of their rent from the cost of parking.
Great. Lira?
Well, those were fabulous, Rick. I think if I had a number one thing I would like to see to at least try to start the road of correcting this affordability crisis that we have right now is to get corporations out of the ability of being landlords. I don't think we should have corporate landlords. I don't think that should be legal. I think that's one of our biggest problems. I watched a Senate hearing on it a couple years ago and was shocked at some of the tactics that they do because every penny counts. I don't have a problem at all with small-time landlords. It's these corporate landlords. That's the biggest thing. I would definitely vote yes on 33 because I want more local control, not less. It's a very simple measure, and it does not establish rent control. It just removes barriers so that we can address things locally. And I do think we need to look very closely at Prop 34 and vote no on that as well.
Great. And Lee, you've got 35 seconds.
I'm with Lira. I would like to see no more housing bonds. I would like to see affordability bonds. I would like to see the city and the county go into partnership with homeowners by putting the 10% down, being on the deed, and when they refinance, they have to pay back. I'd like to see first and last partnerships with the city or the county on renters to help people get into housing, not provide profits for filthy rich people who think they don't have enough money.
Fabulous. Well, thank you. I wish we'd started on these earlier because these are the meat right here. And thank you so much for all of that. Lee Brokaw, Lira Filipini, and Rick Longinotti, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program. And thank you so much for your work.
Thank you, Len.